The wind in the New Mexico territory did not blow. It scoured. It possessed a grit and a temper that Eliza Monroe had never encountered in the cobblestone streets of Boston. Here, the wind carried the taste of sagebrush and the sting of red dust that found its way into the seams of her linen dresses and the pages of her primers. It was the year 1878, and civilization, as the colonel called it, was a fragile thing held together by adobe bricks and the barrel of a rifle. Fort Defiance sat like a scar upon the landscape, a rigid square of military order imposed upon the sprawling, chaotic beauty of the high desert. Tucked uncomfortably against its southern wall was the mission school. It was a place intended for salvation, but to Eliza, it often felt more like a prison constructed of good intentions and stone. She stood by the window of the schoolhouse, watching the heat rise in shimmering waves off the hard-packed earth. Inside, 20 Navajo children sat on wooden benches, their posture stiff, their eyes fixed on slates that meant nothing to them. They wore stiff cotton clothes that scratched their skin. Their hair, once long and black as a raven wing, had been shorn close to their skulls. Reverend Abel Price called it hygiene. Eliza knew it for what it was, a stripping of the soul. "Repeat after me," Eliza said, her voice sounding thin in the dry air. "The cat sits on the mat. The cat sits on the mat." The children droned in unison. The words were hollow. Eliza felt a familiar ache behind her ribs. She had come west with a heart full of missionary zeal and a desperate need to send money back to her family in the East. The salary of $25 a month was more than she could earn as a governess in Boston. She had imagined herself a bringer of light, teaching literature and geography. Instead, she found herself an instrument of erasure. Every English word she forced into their mouths seemed to push a Navajo word out, leaving the children silent and hollow. Later that afternoon, the sun hung low and bloody over the western mesas. Eliza made her way to the officers' mess to collect her weekly rations, trying to ignore the coarse laughter of the soldiers near the stables. "I tell you, it was him," a private named Miller was saying, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Cade Nez, I saw the tracks. He is not just a buck, he is a ghost. He hit that supply wagon 3 days ago and vanished before the dust settled. He is a horse thief and a savage," another soldier replied, polishing his bayonet. "Colonel Briggs says he is leading the resistance. If we catch him, he swings." Eliza hurried past them, clutching her shawl. The name Cade Nez was spoken around the fort like a curse. To the military, he was a phantom, a dangerous agitator who refused to go to the reservation, a man who struck at supply lines and stole horses to feed the starving families hiding in the canyons. They said he was violent, a relic of a war the Army claimed was already won. But Eliza had seen something different. Just 2 days prior, while shaking a rug out by the perimeter fence, she had looked up toward the red ridge that overlooked the valley. There, standing motionless against the turquoise sky, was a silhouette. It was a man on a painted pony, holding a rifle not in a firing position, but resting easily across his saddle. He was not attacking. He was watching. His gaze was fixed not on the soldiers drilling in the yard, but on the school playground where the children were marched in straight lines. It was a vigil. That evening, Eliza went to the well to draw water. The well was the heart of the conflict, though few in the East would understand why. It tapped into a natural spring, a deep vein of sweet, cold water that the Navajo considered the lifeblood of their ancestors. The Army had walled it off, built a pump house over it, and claimed it as government property. To drink from it without offering a prayer feather was, to the locals, a desecration. To Colonel Briggs, it was simply logistics. He who held the water held the land. As she pumped the handle, the water gushed into her tin bucket. The cool spray hit her face, a momentary relief from the relentless aridity. She looked toward the darkness of the canyon mouth. Somewhere out there was Cade Nez. Was he truly the monster the soldiers described, or was he simply a man watching his world be fenced in? The morning ritual was the only thing that kept Eliza grounded. Each day at dawn, before the bell rang for morning prayers, she went to the back door of the kitchen. There, The cook from the mess hall would leave a pail of cow's milk. And May O'Rourke, the woman who ran the only saloon and bakery within 50 miles, would send over a loaf of sourdough bread for the teacher. On this particular Tuesday, the air was cold enough to see one's breath. Eliza opened the heavy oak door, expecting the usual tin pail. It was there, but beside it sat something else. 2 glass bottles, corked and filled with rich, creamy goat milk, sat next to a flat, round loaf of cornbread wrapped in a corn husk. Beside the food lay a small pouch made of soft buckskin, embroidered with intricate beadwork in colors of the earth and sky. Eliza knelt, her skirts pooling in the dust. She touched the warm cornbread. It smelled of wood smoke and roasted grain, a scent far earthier and sweeter than the sour yeast of the fort bread. Teacher Eliza jumped and turned. Standing in the shadow of the woodpile was a small boy, one of her youngest students. His school name was Thomas, but she knew his mother called him Ashki. "Thomas," Eliza whispered, "do you know who brought this?" The boy's dark eyes darted toward the soldiers patrolling the perimeter wall, then back to the food. He stepped closer, his voice barely a breath. "It is from him," the boy said. "The tall warrior, Cade Nez." Eliza's heart gave a strange, startled thump. She looked out at the horizon, where the dawn was just beginning to bleed purple into the black. Why would a man hunted by the army bring breakfast to the woman teaching his people's children to forget him? She stood up, scanning the distance, and then she saw him. He was far away, perched on a ridge a quarter of a mile out, but the air was so clear she could see the details. He sat atop a roan horse, his spine straight as a lance. He wore a shirt of dark indigo and buckskin leggings. His hair was not shorn. It hung in 2 heavy braids wrapped in otter fur, falling over his chest. A rifle was slung across his back, but his hands were empty, resting on the pommel of his saddle. He was looking directly at her. The distance was too great to see the color of his eyes, but Eliza felt the weight of his gaze physically, like a touch on her shoulder. There was no malice in his posture, only a profound stillness. She raised a hand, unsure if she was waving or simply acknowledging his presence. The warrior nodded a single, sharp motion of his chin. Then he turned his horse and melted into the landscape, vanishing among the juniper and sandstone as if he were made of the earth itself. Eliza exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath. She picked up the goat milk and the cornbread. They were heavy in her hands. This was not an act of war, it was an act of sustenance. The days turned into weeks, and the routine solidified. Every morning, goat milk and cornbread appeared. Sometimes there were dried berries, sometimes a handful of pine nuts. Eliza began to share these secret rations with the children during recess, crumbling the cornbread into their hands. Their faces would light up, a flicker of recognition in eyes that had become dull with homesickness. They knew the taste. It was the taste of home. But the fragile peace of the mission was shattered on a Thursday night. A girl named Sarah, formerly Najoni, collapsed in the dormitory. Her skin was burning hot, her breath rattling in her chest like dry leaves. Eliza ran to the infirmary, her lantern swinging wildly. She pounded on the door until the drowsy orderly answered. "Where's Dr. Albright?" she demanded. "He is in town. Miss Monroe." The orderly mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Playing poker at O'Rourke's. I need quinine. I need laudanum. Anything for a fever." The orderly shrugged. "We are out of quinine until the supply train comes next month. I have some castor oil. Castor oil will not bring down a fever of 103 degrees. Eliza cried, pushing past him to rummage through the cabinets. They were bare, save for dirty bandages and empty brown bottles. She ran back to the dormitory, terror gripping her throat. Sarah was delirious, thrashing on the narrow cot. The other children huddled in the corners, wide-eyed and silent. The heat radiating from the little girl's body was terrifying. Eliza soaked rags in the water bucket and pressed them to the child's forehead, but the water warmed almost instantly. "Please," Eliza whispered, holding the girl's small, burning hand. "Please do not die." She had seen too many children die here. They died of measles, of consumption, of a broken heart. She could not lose another one. She sat by the bedside, singing a lullaby in English that meant nothing to the fevered mind, feeling utterly useless. Her civilization had no medicine for this. A soft scratching sound came from the back door of the schoolhouse. Eliza froze. It was 2 hours past midnight. The fort was silent. She stood up, smoothing her apron, and walked to the door. Her hand trembled as she slid the bolt back. There was no one there. The night air was cold and empty, but on the stone step lay the familiar buckskin pouch. Next to it was a bundle of dried gray-green leaves tied with a strip of red cloth and a scrap of brown paper. Eliza picked them up and hurried back to the light of the lantern. She unfolded the paper, written in charcoal. In large, blocky letters that spoke of a hand unfamiliar with the pen were 3 commands: for fever, boil, make her drink. Eliza looked at the dried leaves. Sage globe mallow. She did not know the names, but she brought the bundle to her nose. The scent was pungent, sharp, and clean. It smelled like the wind that swept through the canyons. Cade Nez. He had been watching. He knew the child was sick even before the doctor did. She did not hesitate. She ran to the small pot-belly stove in the corner of the classroom, stoked the dying embers, and set a kettle of water to boil. She crumbled the leaves into the water, watching the liquid turn a deep, rich gold. When it was cool enough, she lifted Sarah's head. "Drink, sweet one, drink," the girl sputtered, fighting the bitter taste. But Eliza persisted, spoonful after spoonful. She forced the dark tea down the child's throat. Eliza sat vigil for the rest of the night, holding Sarah's hand, watching the rise and fall of her chest. As the first gray light of dawn touched the window pane, Sarah shifted. Her breathing deepened. Eliza touched her forehead. It was cool and damp. The fever had broken. Tears of relief pricked Eliza's eyes. She looked at the empty cup on the table and the remaining dried leaves. The man the colonel called a savage, the man the reverend called a heathen, had saved the life that their science had abandoned. The next morning, the sun seemed brighter, the air less oppressive. Sarah was weak, but sleeping peacefully. Eliza stepped out onto the back porch. She needed to say thank you, though she did not know how. She looked toward the ridge. He was there, as she knew he would be. This time, she did not just wave. She placed her hand over her heart, held it there for a long moment, and then extended her palm open toward him. On the ridge, the warrior sat motionless. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and touched his own chest. The connection was electric, terrifying in its intimacy. "Miss Monroe!" The harsh voice of Reverend Abel Price shattered the moment. Eliza spun around. The Reverend was striding across the yard, his black coat flapping like the wings of a carrion bird. Behind him walked Colonel Harlan Briggs and a man Eliza detested, Silas Crowley, the Indian agent. "Good morning, Reverend," Eliza said, composing her face. "Colonel, Mr. Crowley." "We heard there was illness in the night," the Reverend said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her disheveled hair. "Why was the doctor not summoned?" "The doctor was unavailable," Eliza said coolly, "and the infirmary was empty of medicine." Colonel Briggs grunted, adjusting his gloves. He was a man of iron and regulations, with a mustache that hid a mouth permanently set in a frown. "We do what we can, Miss Monroe, but these people, they have weak constitutions. They do not adapt well to civilized living." "Perhaps it is the civilized living that is killing them," Eliza retorted before she could stop herself. Silas Crowley chuckled. He was a soft man, dressed in a suit that cost more than Eliza's yearly salary, with eyes that assessed everything: land, horses, women in terms of dollar value. Now, Miss Monroe. Compassion is a virtue, but sentimentality is a vice. We are here to save them from themselves. Speaking of which, Colonel, the survey for the new rail line is complete. The engineers believe the water table near the spring is sufficient for a refueling depot. Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "The spring?" she asked. "But that is the only source of fresh water for the school, and for the Navajo family still in the hills." "Progress, my dear," Crowley smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "The railroad brings the future, We cannot let a few superstitious traditions stand in the way of commerce. The natives will be relocated to the Bosque Reservation further south. It is for their own good. Better management. The Bosque is a dust bowl, Eliza said, her voice rising. There is no water there. You would be sending them to die. They will go where they are told, Colonel Briggs said sharply. My orders are to secure the territory. If that means moving them to clear the way for the train, then they will move. Eliza looked past them, toward the ridge. The warrior was gone. She realized then the magnitude of the danger. It was not just about haircuts and English lessons anymore. They were planning to take the water. They were planning to erase the people entirely. And she was standing in the middle of it, drawing a salary from the very men plotting the destruction. Later that day, Eliza walked to the sacred spring. She knelt by the water, watching her reflection ripple. She felt torn in two. Half of her was the Boston girl who wanted to be safe, who wanted to follow the rules and go home. The other half was the woman who had boiled strange herbs in the middle of the night and trusted a man with a rifle over a man with a Bible. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small buckskin pouch Cade had left. Inside, she found a single, smooth turquoise stone. It was cool to the touch. Bread and milk, she whispered to the water. You bring me bread and milk to keep them alive, and now herbs to heal them. She realized she was no longer just a teacher. She had become a conduit. Cade Nez was not just watching, he was supplying, and she was the distribution line. If she continued, she would be aiding a rebel. She would be a traitor to her government. She looked back at the school, where Sarah was sleeping safely because of the savage medicine. Eliza Munro closed her hand tight around the turquoise stone. She stood up and brushed the dust from her skirt. Let the colonel draw his maps. Let the reverend preach his sermons. She had made a choice, though she had not spoken it aloud yet. She would take the bread. She would take the milk. And if the time came, she would take the stand. From the cliffs above, unseen in the shadows of the sandstone. Cade Nez watched the woman in the calico dress stand up by the water. He lowered his rifle, his finger brushing the trigger guard. She had used the medicine. She had saved the child. He did not smile, for his life had little room for such softness. But as he turned his pony away from the edge, he whispered a promise to the wind, a promise that no one but the earth heard. Watch over her, he said, for she holds the heart of the people in her hands. The heat in the classroom that afternoon was a physical weight, heavy enough to press the breath out of a grown man, let alone a child. The air smelled of chalk dust and unwashed wool. Eliza Munro stood at the front of the room, her hand cramping around a piece of slate, trying to teach the concept of long division to students who had been raised counting sheep and stars, not abstract numbers on a ledger. In the third row sat a boy named Samuel. His Navajo name was Hastian, which meant something strong and grounded. But here he was, just Samuel. He was 8 years old, with eyes that were usually bright with mischief, but had lately grown dull and guarded. He dropped his slate pencil. It clattered loudly on the wooden floor. Without thinking, Samuel whispered to the boy next to him. It was a reflex, a quiet request for help. But the words that left his mouth were not English. They were the guttural, flowing sounds of Dine Bizad. The silence that followed was instant and terrifying. Reverend Abel Price, who had been dozing in the corner chair with a Bible on his knee, was on his feet in a heartbeat. He crossed the room with long, predatory strides. Before Eliza could even raise a hand, the sound of a slap cracked through the stagnant air like a pistol shot. Samuel's head snapped back. A small trickle of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. He did not cry out, but his small body went rigid. English, the Reverend roared, his face flushing a deep, ugly crimson. In this house, under God's roof, we speak the language of civilization. We do not speak the tongue of heathens. Reverend Price, Eliza cried out, dropping her chalk. She rushed forward, placing herself between the towering man and the trembling boy. He is only a child. He dropped his pencil. It was a mistake. The Reverend looked down at her, his eyes cold behind his wire-rimmed spectacles. A mistake is a spilled cup of milk. Miss Munro, Speaking that tongue is a sin of defiance. It shows that the devil still has a hold on his tongue. He pointed a long, bony finger at the door. Out! Kneel in the yard. Face the sun. No supper. No water until vespers. It is 100 degrees out there, Eliza argued, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and outrage. You cannot leave a child in this sun without water. It is cruel. It is discipline. Price snapped. You are a sentimental woman, Miss Monroe. Your Boston sensibilities have no place in the taming of savages. Do not make me report your lack of fortitude to the bishop or to the colonel. We need teachers here, not mothers. He grabbed Samuel by the collar of his rough shirt and marched him out the door. Eliza stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the other children. They were staring at their desks, terrifyingly still, having learned that invisibility was their only defense. That evening, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, but the earth held the heat like a heated iron skillet. Samuel was still kneeling by the woodpile, his lips cracked, his small frame swaying with exhaustion. The Reverend had finally allowed him to go to the dormitory, but the order for no supper stood firm. Eliza sat in her small room, staring at her unlit oil lamp. She could not eat her own ration of salt pork and biscuits, knowing the boy was lying in the dark with an empty stomach. The image of his bloody lip and the Reverend's self-righteous fury burned in her mind. A sentimental woman. He had called her. Eliza stood up. She smoothed her skirts with a sharp, defiant motion. If compassion was a weakness, then she would happily be the weakest soul in the territory. She waited until the moon was high and the heavy snoring of the Reverend drifted through the thin walls of the parsonage. Then she picked up her shawl and crept toward the kitchen. She opened the back door, expecting nothing but the night air. Instead, there it was, the daily offering, a small jug of goat milk, cool condensation beating on the glass, and a round loaf of cornbread wrapped in blue corn husks. Eliza stared at it. For weeks, these gifts had been anonymous acts of kindness. Tonight, they felt like ammunition. She went into the pantry and took a thick slice of the white flour bread baked by the army cook bread that was bland, airy, and tasteless. She placed it next to the dense, sweet-smelling Navajo cornbread. She poured the goat milk into a tin cup. She held the 2 pieces of bread in her hands. One was the food of the conqueror, soft and easy to swallow, but lacking substance. The other was the food of the earth, hard and enduring. She pressed them together in her napkin. Tonight, the boy would eat both. Tonight, he will survive because of both. She slipped out into the yard, moving through the shadows toward the boys' dormitory window. She found Samuel awake, staring at the ceiling. When he saw her face at the window, his eyes widened. Eat, she whispered, passing the bundle through the bars. Fast! She watched him devour the food, crumbs of white and yellow grain falling onto his blanket. When he finished the milk, he looked at her, and for the first time in months, he smiled. It was a small, fleeting thing, but it broke Eliza's heart. Sleep now, Samuel, she whispered. She turned to go back to her quarters, her pulse still racing from the thrill of her small rebellion. She moved toward the water pump to rinse the milk cup. You have a gentle heart for a teacher of words. The voice came from the darkness near the pump house, deep and resonant like the rumble of distant thunder. Eliza gasped and spun around, nearly dropping the tin cup. A figure detached itself from the shadows of the water tank. It was him, Cade Nez. He was closer than she had ever seen him. He was not a silhouette on a ridge anymore. He was a man of flesh and blood, standing less than 10 feet away. The moonlight caught the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the heavy silver concho belt at his waist. He smelled of sagebrush, wood smoke, and the musk of a horse that had been ridden hard. Eliza's first instinct was to look for the sentries. The wall was only 50 yards away. If they saw him, they would shoot him dead without a warning. "You should not be here," she hissed, stepping closer to him to keep their voices low. The guards are looking at the desert, not the well," Cade said. His English was slow, deliberate, and surprisingly clear. You use the herbs. The girl, Nijoni, she lives. Sarah, Eliza corrected automatically, then stopped herself. Yes, she lives because of you. She looked up at him, really looked at him. He was tall, towering over her, but his posture was not threatening. It was watchful. Who are you? Why are you risking your life to bring milk and bread to a fort that wants to kill you? Cade took a step forward. The moonlight washed over his face, revealing a jagged white scar that ran from his jawline down into the collar of his shirt. My sister, he said simply. She is the one you call Sarah. Her name is Nijoni. Beautiful voice. Eliza felt the breath catch in her throat. She is your sister. They took her when the corn was knee-high, Cade said, his voice devoid of self-pity but heavy with old anger. They cut her hair. They took her name. I cannot take her back yet. The soldiers would hunt us down, and she is too small to run in the mountains. So I bring the strength of the earth to her, bread, milk, medicine. I keep her body alive until I can free her spirit. He looked at Eliza, his dark eyes boring into hers. And you are the daughter of the healer. Eliza frowned, confused. My father was a doctor, but he... Dr. Monroe, Cade said. He touched the scar on his neck. 12 winters ago, there was a skirmish near the Red Rocks. I was a boy, foolish and brave. I took a saber cut. Your father found me bleeding in the sage. He did not finish me. He sewed my skin. He gave me water. He told the soldiers I was dead so they would not hang me. Eliza stared at him, stunned. Her father, who had died of typhus 3 years ago, had never mentioned saving a Navajo boy, but it sounded exactly like him. He had been a man who saw wounds, not uniforms. You knew him, she whispered. I carry his mark. Cade said, life for life. That is the way. He saved me. Now I ask you to save her. I am trying, Eliza said, her voice trembling. But I am just one woman. And they are an army. An army moves on orders, Cade said. But orders come from men, and men have secrets. He stepped closer, and the space between them seemed to charge with a sudden, intense energy. Eliza could see the pulse beating in his throat. She should have been terrified. She was standing in the dark with a wanted man, a warrior who could snap her neck with one hand, but she did not feel fear. She felt a strange, magnetic pull, a sense of inevitability. What do you mean? She asked. Cade glanced toward the colonel's administrative building, where a single lamp still burned in the window. The tall fence is not just to keep children in. It is to keep the water taken. Listen to them, teacher. Listen to what Spider-Man says to the Stone Chief. Eliza realized he meant Silas Crowley and Colonel Briggs. Crowley and Briggs. Listen, Cade repeated. Be my eyes inside the stone walls. I will be your strength outside. Keep them alive. Tell me when the wagons come. Eliza shook her head. If I do that, if I help you, I am a traitor. They could hang me. Cade looked at her for a long silence. Then he reached into the pouch at his waist and pulled out a fresh loaf of cornbread, warm from a fire she could not see. He held it out to her. Is it treason to feed a hungry child? He asked softly. Is it treason to heal a fever? Eliza looked at the bread. Then she looked at the colonel's window. Earlier that day, while waiting to plead for Samuel, she had stood outside that very office. She had heard voices through the open window. The survey is done. Silas, the aquifer is massive. Once we move the tribe to the bosque, the railroad takes the spring. We will have a depot here by Christmas. And the children, Colonel moved them first. The parents will follow the brats. It is the quickest way to clear the valley without wasting bullets. She had suppressed the memory because it was too monstrous to believe. But looking at Cade now, seeing the desperate love he had for the sister he could not touch, the truth settled in her stomach like a stone. They were not teaching these children to civilize them. They were holding them hostage to steal a river. Eliza Monroe reached out and took the cornbread. Her fingers brushed against Cade's palm. His skin was rough, calloused from the bow and the rain. But his touch was startlingly warm. The contact lasted only a second, but it sent a jolt through her arm that settled deep in her chest. "I heard them," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "They plan to move the children to the bosque, to the dry lands. They want the spring for the steam engines." Cade's eyes darkened. A flash of obsidian fire. His hand closed into a fist at his side. "They want to trade blood for steam. They will move them soon," Eliza said. "I do not know the day, but soon. Then we must be ready," Cade said. He stepped back, the distance between them opening up again, leaving her cold. "I will come every night. I will bring bread. I will bring milk. You brought me the day—" "Cade," she said, using his name for the first time. It felt foreign and heavy on her tongue. He paused, half turned toward the darkness. "Why me?" she asked. "Why trust the daughter of a soldier?" "Because you fed the boy tonight," Cade said. "I watched you. You mixed the white bread with the corn. You understand that to survive, one must sometimes be two things at once." He looked past her, toward the pump house that imprisoned the sacred spring. He gestured to the water, then to the sleeping schoolhouse. "When they move the water, they move the people," he said, his voice low and ominous, a warning that chilled the sweat on her neck. "Remember that, Eliza Monroe. The water and the blood flow in the same vein. Cut one, and you spill the other." He turned and moved with the silent grace of a mountain lion. One moment he was there, a solid, breathing presence that made the air vibrate. The next, he was gone, swallowed by the desert night. Eliza stood alone by the well. She clutched the warm cornbread to her chest, breathing in the scent of smoke and earth. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked up at the stars, vast and indifferent overhead. She had come west to teach English and save souls, but as she stood in the shadow of the stolen spring, holding the bread of a rebel, she realized that her own soul was the one in danger of being lost, or perhaps, for the first time, found. She turned and walked back to the school, the bread hidden in the folds of her apron. She was no longer just a teacher. She was a conspirator, and the war had just crossed her threshold. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm as steady and dangerous as a heartbeat. The dawn no longer meant just the rising of the sun. It meant the arrival of the offering. Every morning, when the sky was the color of a bruised plum, Eliza would unlock the back door of the kitchen, and every morning, without fail, they were there, a round loaf of cornbread, still warm, wrapped in blue husks, a glass jar of goat milk, the cream separated and floating rich at the top. Sometimes, there were small bundles of dried juniper berries or piñon nuts, tied with yucca fiber. Eliza would gather these treasures into her apron, her heart thumping a frantic tattoo against her ribs until she was safely back inside. At noon, when the other teachers retired to their quarters for tea, she would herd the Navajo children into the corner of the dusty schoolyard. There, protected by the bulk of the water tank, she would break the bread. "For strength," she would whisper, pressing a chunk of the dense, sweet corn cake into Samuel's hand. "For courage," she would say to little Sarah, pouring a measure of milk into the girl's tin cup. The children ate with a reverence that broke her heart. They knew where the food came from. They knew who walked in the night while the soldiers slept. The connection between Eliza and Cade deepened with every sunrise, though they rarely spoke more than a few words. Sometimes, when the moon was dark, he would be waiting for her in the deep shadow of the wood pile. "The boy, Samuel?" Cade asked one night, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the ground beneath her feet. "Does he still cough?" "Less," Eliza replied, keeping her voice to a whisper. She handed him the empty milk jar, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was rough, calloused from the bowstring and the rain, but his touch was startlingly gentle. "The herb tea helped, but he is thin. They work them hard in the garden." "He is strong," Cade said. He did not pull his hand away immediately. For a second, they stood suspended in the darkness, connected by the glass jar and the unspoken current that ran between them. Eliza could smell the sage on his clothes, the faint scent of leather and wood smoke. It was a wild, clean smell, so different from the stale tobacco and bay rum of the officers in the fort. "And you?" Cade asked, his eyes catching the faint starlight. "Are you strong?" Eliza. It was the first time he had asked about her. Not the teacher, not the spy. Her, "I am trying to be—" She breathed. He nodded, a slow, solemn movement. "Good. You will need to be—" Inside the fort, the atmosphere was tightening like a noose. Reverend Price prowled the schoolroom with suspicious eyes. He had noticed that the children seemed less lethargic, their cheeks less hollow. "They are thriving too well on meager rations," he muttered one afternoon, watching the children play tag in the yard. "It is unnatural. Perhaps they are stealing from the pantry." "Or perhaps God is sustaining them," Eliza said, not looking up from her grating. "God does not fatten heathens without repentance." The Reverend snapped. Colonel Briggs took a harder line. After a sentry reported seeing tracks near the north wall, he issued a new order. Any native found within rifle range of the fort walls after sunset was to be fired upon. Warning shots were optional. "We cannot have them lurking," Briggs declared at dinner, slicing his roast beef with surgical precision. "They are scouting, probing our defenses. If they want to come to the fort, they come through the front gate, surrender their weapons, and beg for entry." The order chilled Eliza to the bone. Every morning when she opened the back door, she expected to find a body instead of bread. But Cade was a ghost. He moved where the soldiers did not look, slipped through shadows that seemed too thin to hold a man. Eliza began her own quiet rebellion inside the classroom. The curriculum demanded she teach them that their culture was dead, their language a sin. But when the Reverend was absent, she would close the door. "Tell me," she would whisper to the class, "what is the word for mountain in your tongue?" The children would look at her, wide-eyed and fearful. Then, slowly, a brave soul, usually Samuel, would whisper, "Zil, Zil," Eliza would repeat, her pronunciation clumsy but earnest. And the word for water, "Tu." She let them tell stories in hushed tones. They spoke of the coyote who stole the stars, of the spider woman who taught them to weave. She saw the light return to their eyes, a spark of identity that the shears and the soap had not quite extinguished. It was dangerous work. If Price heard them, he would have her dismissed and sent back to Boston in disgrace. But looking at their faces, Eliza knew she could not stop. She was building a bridge, plank by plank, over a chasm of silence. Then came the night of the sandstorm. The wind began to howl just after supper, a shrieking banshee that drove sand through every crack in the walls. By 10 o'clock, the world outside was a swirling vortex of red dust. Eliza realized with a jolt that she had forgotten to fill the water barrel in the kitchen. The cook would need it for breakfast porridge. Wrapping a heavy shawl around her head, she grabbed the bucket and pushed out into the gale. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet. The sand stung her face like 1,000 needles. She stumbled toward the pump house, blinded and gasping. She reached the pump and leaned against the stone wall, trying to catch her breath. Suddenly, a hand grabbed her arm. She screamed, the sound swallowed instantly by the wind. "Quiet!" a voice hissed in her ear. She was yanked into the narrow space between the pump house and the perimeter wall, a sliver of darkness sheltered from the worst of the storm. She found herself pressed up against a hard, unyielding chest. It was Cade. He had pulled her in to shield her from the wind, but now they were trapped. The storm roared around them, isolating them in a pocket of intimacy. His body was a wall of heat against the biting cold of the wind. She could feel the steady thump of his heart against her own chest. "Cade," she gasped, looking up. He was looking down at her, his face inches from hers. The dust coated his eyelashes and caught in the braids of his hair. His hands were on her shoulders, holding her steady, his grip firm and possessive. "The wind is angry tonight," he murmured, his voice low and rough. "It hunts." I needed water," she stammered. She was acutely aware of the length of his body pressed against hers, the solid muscle of his thighs, the breadth of his shoulders. It was improper. It was scandalous. It was the most alive she had ever felt. "Close your eyes," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "Do not fight the dust. Breathe with the wind, not against it." Eliza obeyed. She closed her eyes and let her head fall back slightly. She felt his hand move, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, brushing away the grit. The gesture was so tender it made her knees weak. For a moment, the war did not exist. The colonel, the reverend, the railroad, they were all swept away by the storm. There was only the wind, the dark, and the man who brought her bread. He leaned closer. She could feel his breath on her lips. She parted them slightly, a silent invitation she hadn't known she was making. His head tilted, his mouth hovering a breath away from hers. "Halt! Who goes there?" The shout from a passing patrol cut through the wind like a knife. Cade froze. His eyes snapped open, the tenderness vanishing instantly, replaced by the hard, cold look of the warrior. He released her and pressed a finger to his lips. "Go!" he whispered. "Now!" Before she could protest, he dissolved into the swirling sand, scaling the wall with impossible speed. Eliza was left alone, clutching her empty bucket, her lips tingling with the ghost of a kiss that had almost been. The next day, Eliza moved with a new resolve. The near kiss had terrified her, not because of the danger, but because of the depth of her own wanting. She realized she could no longer sit on the fence. She had to choose. She began to listen. She lingered outside the colonel's office when the door was ajar. She sorted the mail on the Reverend's desk, her eyes scanning for official seals. She pieced together the fragments. A letter from the Department of the Interior, a map with red lines drawn through the valley, a date circled on the calendar, October 15th. That was the date of the relocation. The children were to be moved by wagon train to the railhead, then shipped south to the Bosque Reservation. The land and the sacred spring would be handed over to the railroad company the following week. October 15th. It was only 10 days away. She had to tell Cade, but Cade had his own battles. Up in the canyons, the tribe was fracturing. Young hotheads, led by a warrior named Hashka, wanted blood. They argued that if the soldiers were going to take everything, they should die fighting. They wanted to raid the fort, burn the school, and slaughter the garrison. Cade stood in the council circle, his voice calm but steely. "If we kill them, 10 more will come, 100 more. They have an endless supply of men. We have only our children. If we strike now, we give them the excuse to wipe us out. So we do nothing." Hashke spat. "We let them take the water. We let the woman teacher steal the minds of our sons. The woman is not stealing them," Cade said quietly. "She is feeding them. She is keeping them alive for us. She is white," Hashke sneered. "She is the enemy. She is a bridge," Cade said, "and we must cross it before it burns." The tension in the valley spilled over into the town of Gallup, 5 miles south of the fort. It was the 4th of July, and a small, dusty festival was underway. Eliza had driven the buckboard down to buy supplies fabric, slate pencils, and flour. The town was decked in bunting, but the mood was ugly. A sign nailed to the door of the general store read, "No Indians or dogs allowed." As Eliza came out of the store, she saw a commotion near the watering trough. 2 elderly Navajo men, their faces weathered like old leather, were trying to water their mules. A group of cowboys, drunk on cheap whiskey and patriotism, had surrounded them. "Hey there, Chief," one cowboy sneered, shoving the old man. "This water is for Americans. You savages go drink from a mud puddle." The old man stumbled, clutching his hat. The crowd laughed. Something in Eliza snapped. It was the same heat she had felt when the Reverend slapped Samuel. She dropped her parcels and marched into the fray. "Stop it," she commanded, her voice ringing out with the authority of the schoolroom. "Leave him alone." The cowboy turned, blinking bleary eyes at her. "Well now, if it ain't the schoolmarm. You lost. Missy, are you sticking up for these redskins?" I'm sticking up for common decency, Eliza said, her chin high. They are old men. Let them water their beasts. You got a lot of pity for 'em, don't you? The cowboy sneered, stepping closer. Maybe you like 'em. Maybe you like the smell of 'em. I prefer their company to yours, Eliza retorted. At least they have honor. The crowd went silent. The cowboy's face darkened. Careful, lady. You start sounding like an Indian lover. You might get treated like one. Eliza stared him down until he spat on the ground and turned away. She helped the old men water their mules, ignoring the whispers and the hostile glares burning into her back. She knew then that she had crossed a line. She was no longer one of them. That night, she met Cade at the woodpile. The air was thick with impending rain. October 15th, she whispered, pressing a slip of paper into his hand. They moved the children at dawn, wagons to the railhead. Cade took the paper, his face grim. 10 days. The soldiers are on high alert, she warned. Briggs knows there is unrest. He has doubled the guard. Cade nodded. Then he reached into his pouch and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in buckskin. It was heavy. I have a favor to ask, he said. A dangerous one. What is it? This is a stone from the sacred mountain, he said. It belongs to my grandmother. She is old, and she is hiding in the canyon, but she needs it. It is her connection to her ancestors. If she dies without it, her spirit will wander. He pressed the bundle into Eliza's hands. The boy, Samuel. His uncle is a scout for the army. He goes into the canyon tomorrow. Give this to Samuel. Tell him to give it to his uncle. The uncle will get it for my grandmother. Eliza looked at the bundle. If she were caught passing contraband, even a rocket would be seen as aiding the enemy. It was proof of collusion. She looked up at Cade. His eyes were dark, pleading not for his own life, but for the soul of an old woman he loved. If they catch me, she started. I know, Cade said. I will not ask if you cannot do it. Eliza thought of Samuel's bruised lip. She thought of the cornbread in her apron. She thought of the cowboy's sneer in town. She closed her fingers around the stone. It felt warm, as if it held the heat of the sun. I will do it, she said. Cade reached out and covered her hand with his. Thank you, Eliza. Bread and milk, she whispered, a sad smile touching her lips. You feed their bodies. I suppose I can feed their spirits. He squeezed her hand. Hard. You are more than a teacher now, he said. You are of the people. He disappeared into the night, leaving Eliza standing in the dark with a rock that weighed as much as her conscience. She turned back to the school, the stone burning a hole in her pocket. She had chosen her side. Now she just had to survive it. The morning sun did not bring warmth. It brought exposure. A private on patrol, a boy no older than 19 named Miller, found the footprints in the soft mud near the kitchen door. They were moccasin prints, distinct and undeniable, circling the water pump and leading away toward the canyon. By noon, the atmosphere in the fort had shifted from watchful to punitive. Colonel Harlan Briggs stood in the center of the dusty courtyard, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. Before him, 5 Navajo boys, including Samuel, were lined up. They were stripped to the waist, their small, brown backs shivering not from cold, but from terror. We have intruders, the colonel announced, his voice carrying to the schoolhouse porch where Eliza stood, her knuckles white as she gripped the railing. And intruders do not come without invitation. Someone inside is signaling them. Someone is leaving the gate unlatched. He walked down the line, tapping his riding crop against his thigh. Since no one will confess to aiding the enemy, the lesson will be shared. Colonel, please! Eliza ran down the steps, ignoring the Reverend's hand trying to restrain her. They are children. They were asleep in the dormitory. They know nothing of footprints. They are scouts in training. Miss Monroe, Briggs said coldly, not looking at her. Corporal, proceed. 5 lashes each, to encourage honesty. The corporal hesitated, but orders were orders. He raised the leather strap. The sound of the lash striking skin was sickeningly wet. Samuel did not cry out, but his body jerked violently. Stop it! Eliza screamed. She threw herself forward, grabbing the corporal's arm. "You are monsters! Stop it!" Colonel Briggs turned, his face a mask of icy disdain. He signaled to a guard. "Remove Miss Monroe! She is hysterical!" A soldier grabbed Eliza by the waist and hauled her back. She struggled, kicking and shouting, but she was thrown to the ground near the schoolhouse steps. Her palms scraped against the gravel, bleeding. She looked up, breathless and weeping, to see the lash fall again, and again, from the ridge overlooking the fort, a mile away. Cade Nez watched through the sight of his rifle. His finger tightened on the trigger. He saw the red welts rising on Samuel's back. He saw the welts on his own sister, Najoni, who had been forced to watch, her face buried in her hands. He saw Eliza thrown into the dirt like a sack of grain. The rage in his chest was a physical fire, hot enough to burn his lungs. He shifted his aim to the colonel's chest. One shot. He could end it with one shot. But then he saw Eliza. She pushed herself up from the gravel. She looked directly toward his hiding spot on the ridge, though she could not possibly see him. She shook her head frantically. She raised a hand, palm out a desperate signal to stop. Then, she pulled a handkerchief from her sleeve and held it against the window pane of the schoolhouse, counting to 3 before pulling it away. 3 hours after sunset. The spring. Cade lowered the rifle. His breath came in ragged gasps. He wanted blood. But the woman was right. If he fired now, the soldiers would massacre every child in that yard before his brass casing hit the ground. He lowered the hammer of his gun. The click loud in the silence of the rocks. He would wait. But the colonel was a dead man walking. He just did not know the hour of his death yet. The moon was a sliver of bone in the night sky, offering little light. Eliza waited by the sacred spring, the water bubbling up from the earth with a soft, rhythmic gurgle. She had told the sentry she was sick and needed fresh air, a lie that was half true. The nausea from the morning's brutality had not left her. A pebble skittered across the stone. She turned. Cade was there. He did not greet her. He was pacing like a caged wolf, his energy jagged and dangerous. "I should have killed him," Cade growled, his voice rough. "I had him in my sights. Eliza, I could have put a bullet through his heart." "And then what?" Eliza hissed, stepping into his path. She grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. "Then they shoot the children. Then they burn the village. You know this, Cade. You know the cost. They are beating them," Cade roared, though he kept his volume to a harsh whisper. He pulled away from her, slamming his hand against the stone wall of the pump house. "My sister watched. Did you see her face? They are breaking them, piece by piece." "I saw," Eliza whispered, her voice breaking. "I tried to stop them. They threw me down." Cade froze. He turned slowly back to her. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face where a bruise was beginning to bloom on her cheekbone. "They hurt you." "It is nothing," she said, though she leaned slightly into his touch. "But Cade, listen to me. The stone, the sacred stone, did it reach your grandmother?" Cade nodded, the anger momentarily replaced by a solemn gratitude. "It did. She holds it now. She says she can hear the mountains singing again. She says you have a Navajo heart." "Good," Eliza said. She took a deep breath. "Because you need to know the rest. I heard Briggs and Crowley. The relocation date is set, the 15th of October. 5 days, Cade said, the air leaving his lungs. "At dawn," Eliza continued, "they will load the children into wagons, 20 soldiers to guard them. They take the southern pass to the railhead." "The southern pass is narrow," Cade said, his eyes narrowing as the warrior took over. "It is a trap. We can ambush them there. Drop rocks from the cliffs. Cut off the lead wagon." "No," Eliza grabbed his shoulders. "If you attack the wagons, the children will be in the crossfire. The soldiers will panic and shoot blindly. You cannot turn this into a battle, Cade, not with them in the middle." "Then how," he demanded, "do I let them be taken to the wasteland?" "We steal them," Eliza said, her voice trembling but firm. "Before the wagons leave, the night before, I will open the gate." Cade stared at her. "The gate is barred from the inside. There is a guard. I will distract the guard, Eliza said. I will unlock the heavy bar. You and your men come in quietly. We take them out through the spring tunnel, the old drainage pipe you told me about. It is small, but the children fit. And you, Cade asked. If you open that gate, you can never go back to your classroom. They will hang you for treason. I know, Eliza said softly. She took a step back, but her foot landed on a patch of slick moss near the water's edge. She gasped as her balance failed. Cade moved with lightning speed. He caught her by the waist, but his own momentum carried them both forward. They collapsed onto the soft, damp bank of the spring, half in the water. The splash was loud in the quiet night. The cold water soaked instantly through Eliza's thin cotton skirt and blouse. She sat up, gasping from the shock of the cold, water dripping from her hair. Cade was kneeling beside her, his chest heaving. He reached out to steady her. His hand landed on her collarbone, his thumb resting in the hollow of her throat. The air suddenly felt very thin. Eliza looked up at him. The water had plastered her white blouse to her skin, making it translucent. She saw Cade's eyes drop to the curve of her breast, clearly visible beneath the wet fabric, before snapping back up to her face. He did not pull his hand away. Her heart hammered against his palm. She was shivering, but heat was flooding her veins. "Eliza," he whispered. His voice was not a growl now. It was a rough caress. He leaned in. She could smell the rain on him, the scent of wet stone and skin. He brushed a wet lock of hair from her forehead, his fingers lingering on her cheek. The scar on his neck stood out in the moonlight, a white line against copper skin. "You are cold," he said, but he made no move to help her up. "No," she breathed. "I am not cold." His gaze dropped to her mouth. The tension was a pulled bowstring, vibrating, ready to snap. He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb, his touch agonizingly slow. Eliza's breath hitched. She wanted him to kiss her. She wanted him to pull her into the dark and forget the war, the colonel, the future. "If we do this," Cade murmured, his forehead resting against hers, "there is no turning back, for either of us." "I stopped turning back a long time ago," Eliza whispered. He closed his eyes, fighting a battle within himself. Then, with a groan that sounded like pain, he pulled back. He stood up and offered her his hand. "Go!" he said, his voice tight. "Before I forget that I am a warrior and you are a lady of the East." Eliza took his hand. He pulled her to her feet, the wet fabric of her dress clinging to her legs. For a moment, they stood chest to chest, the heat between them drying the air. Then she turned and ran back toward the fort, her body burning as if she had touched fire. From the shadows of the mesquite bushes 50 yards away, a pair of eyes watched Eliza run. Jonah, the half-blood interpreter who worked for Silas Crowley, lowered his head. He had seen the meeting. He had seen the touch. He had not heard all the words, but he had heard enough. The 15th. The gate. He smiled, a crooked expression that held no joy. Silas Crowley paid $5 for information. This information was worth at least 10. The next morning, Silas Crowley sat in his office, listening to Jonah. He tapped his fingers on the mahogany desk. "So," Crowley mused, lighting a cigar, "the schoolteacher is opening her legs for the savage. And the gate, too." "She meets him in the spring," Jonah said, eyeing the whiskey bottle on the desk. "They plan to take the children the night before the move." Crowley smiled. It was the smile of a reptile basking on a rock. "Let them try. In fact, we will encourage it. If the Indians attack the fort to steal the children, we have every right to defend ourselves with lethal force. We can wipe out Cade Nez and his band in the courtyard. And Miss Monroe, well, tragic collateral damage. A woman led astray by lust and heathen magic." He slid a $10 gold piece across the desk. "You did well, Jonah. Now go tell the colonel to double the guard on the walls, but to keep them hidden. We want the mouse to think the trap is empty." The night of the 14th of October was windless and suffocating. The air hung heavy over Fort Defiance, smelling of dust and dry sage. Eliza could not sleep. She sat on her bed, fully dressed, her bag packed with only the essentials, a canteen, a knife, and the small Bible her mother had given her. She checked her pocket watch. 2:00 in the morning. It was time. She moved through the silent hallways of the school. The floorboards creaked, sounding like gunshots in the quiet. She reached the courtyard. It was empty, too empty. She frowned. Usually, there was a patrol near the gate. Tonight, the yard was deserted. Had they changed the schedule? Then, she smelled it. Smoke. It was faint at first, a tendril of gray curling under the door of the boys' dormitory. Then came the crackle, the sound of dry timber catching. "No," Eliza whispered. She ran toward the dormitory. As she reached the door, the window exploded outward, showering the yard with glass and sparks. A torch, soaked in kerosene, had been thrown inside. "Fire!" she screamed, her voice tearing at her throat. "Fire! Wake up!" She threw open the door. A wall of black smoke hit her, knocking her back. Inside, she could hear the terrified screams of the children. "Samuel Thomas!" She didn't think so. She pulled her shawl over her mouth and dove into the smoke. The heat was intense. The wooden bunks were already catching. She grabbed a sleeping child, pulling him off the bed and shoving him toward the door. She went back for another. The air was thick with soot. She could not breathe. Her eyes stung so badly she was effectively blind. "Teacher," a small voice cried from the corner. "I am here," Eliza choked out. She crawled across the floor, feeling for the small bodies. She found a girl, Najoni, huddled under a cot. "Come with me." She dragged the girl toward the door, but a burning beam from the ceiling crashed down in front of them, blocking the exit. They were trapped. Eliza backed up, shielding Najoni with her own body. The flames licked at the walls, climbing higher. She looked around frantically for another way out, but the smoke was a suffocating blanket. She felt her consciousness slipping. The heat was unbearable. "Cade," she whispered into the roar of the fire. Suddenly, the heavy oak door of the dormitory shattered inward. A figure leapt through the flames, a demon of shadow and vengeance. Cade Nez. He had been waiting at the wall for her signal, but he had seen the smoke first. He wrapped his coat around his arm and smashed through the burning debris. He saw Eliza huddled in the corner, clutching his sister. "Eliza!" he roared. He reached them in 2 strides. He grabbed Najoni with one arm and hauled Eliza up with the other. "Can you run?" he shouted over the noise of the fire. Eliza nodded weakly, though her legs felt like water. "Yes, go!" He shielded them with his body, pushing them through the broken door and out into the courtyard. The fresh air hit Eliza like a hammer. She collapsed to her knees, coughing violently, her lungs burning. The courtyard was chaotic. Soldiers were running with buckets, shouting orders. The firelight illuminated everything in a hellish orange glow. "There!" a voice shouted. "The Indian!" Eliza looked up. 10 soldiers had emerged from the shadows, rifles raised. Silas Crowley stood on the porch of the administration building, pointing a pistol. "Shoot him!" Crowley ordered. Cade stood tall in the center of the yard, the flames raging behind him. He held Eliza against his chest with one arm, his sister clinging to his leg. He looked like a spirit of judgment rising from the inferno. "Hold fire!" Colonel Briggs shouted. Running into the yard, "You will hit the teacher!" Cade looked at the soldiers, his eyes blazing brighter than the fire. He looked down at Eliza, who was limp in his arms, soot streaking her face. "She burns!" Cade's voice boomed across the yard, silencing the men. "She burns, saving your children while you sleep." He bent down and placed Eliza gently on the ground. Away from the heat, he touched her cheek one last time. "Run," he whispered to Najoni. "To the wall." He stood up and raised his hands, drawing every rifle barrel toward him. "I am here," he yelled. "Take me!" Najoni scrambled into the shadows. A shot rang out. Cade jerked, his shoulders spinning back as a bullet tore through the muscle. "No!" Eliza screamed, trying to rise. Cade did not fall. He used the momentum to spin and sprint toward the east wall. He moved with unnatural speed, vaulting over a water trough and launching himself at the wooden palisade. More shots cracked. Dust puffed from the wood around him, but he was over. He was gone. Eliza collapsed back onto the dirt, darkness taking her vision. The last thing she saw was the smirk on Silas Crowley's face fading into a frown as he realized his prey had escaped. The morning after the fire, the air smelled of wet ash and ruin. The boys' dormitory was a skeleton of blackened timber. Eliza sat in the infirmary, her arm bandaged where she had been burned, her lungs still rattling with every breath. She stared at the wall. The door opened. Reverend Price entered, followed by Colonel Briggs. "You are lucky to be alive. Miss Monroe," the Reverend said. There was no kindness in his voice. "Though perhaps luck is not the word. Divine judgment, more likely." "Judgment," Eliza rasped. "I saved 6 children." "You opened the gate," the Reverend said, pointing a shaking finger at her. "We found the bar lifted. You let the wolf in." "The wolf saved us," Eliza said, her voice gaining strength. "While your guards watched the fire burn, he attacked the fort." Silas Crowley appeared in the doorway, looking fresh and rested. "He set the fire to create a diversion. And you, my dear, were his accomplice." "That is a lie," Eliza said. Standing up, she swayed, but she did not sit back down. "The fire started inside. I smelled the kerosene. It was arson." She looked directly at Crowley. "And you knew he was coming?" Crowley's eyes narrowed. "Be careful. Miss Monroe, accusations against a government official are serious. Treason is a hanging offense." "Then hang me," Eliza said. She felt a cold clarity settle over her. The fear was gone, burned away in the fire. "But know this, I am writing to Boston. I am writing to the bishop. I am writing to every newspaper in the East. I will tell them how you starve children, how you beat them, and how you burn them to steal a spring." Colonel Briggs stepped forward. "You will write nothing. You are confined to quarters until the relocation is complete. The wagons leave tomorrow. We are moving the schedule up." "You cannot," Eliza said. "They are injured." "They are terrified." "They go," Briggs said. "And you stay here until we decide what to do with the traitor." They left, locking the door behind them. Eliza walked to the window. She looked out at the scorched earth of the courtyard. She looked toward the ridge. She was a prisoner. Her reputation was destroyed. Her career was over. She touched the bandage on her arm. She had never felt more free. She was no longer Eliza Monroe, the schoolteacher from Boston. She was the woman who had walked through fire, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that Cade would not let the wagons leave tomorrow without a fight. She had to be ready, not to teach, but to fight beside him. The dawn of October 15th broke with a sky the color of bruised iron. The air in the courtyard of Fort Defiance was cold and smelled of wet ash from the burned dormitory, a grim reminder of the chaos of 2 nights prior. Eliza Monroe stood by the lead wagon, her hands clasped tightly before her to hide their trembling. Colonel Harlan Briggs had released her from confinement not out of mercy, but out of necessity. The children were terrified, refusing to board the transport wagons without their teacher, Briggs. Impatient to clear the valley before the railroad surveyors arrived at noon, had ordered Eliza to accompany the convoy as far as the railhead. "Keep them quiet, Miss Monroe," Briggs had warned, adjusting his saber. "If there is trouble, remember that you are as expendable as they are." Eliza looked at the line of children. There were 30 of them, their small wrists bound loosely with hemp rope. It was a precaution, Silas Crowley had argued, to prevent them from jumping off the wagons. To Eliza, it looked like a slave chain. Reverend Abel Price stood on a crate, Bible in hand, his voice booming over the weeping of the younger children. "The Lord guides your path to a new land. Be grateful for this deliverance from savagery." Silas Crowley leaned against a hitching post, lighting a cigar. He caught Eliza's eye and smiled, a thin, reptilian curving of lips that made her stomach turn. He looked too relaxed. He looked like a man who knew the outcome of a game before the cards were dealt. "Board the wagons," the sergeant major shouted. Eliza moved down the line, pretending to check the children's names against a clipboard. "Samuel," she whispered. leaning close to the boy. As she adjusted his collar, a small paring knife she had concealed in her sleeve slid into her hand. With a quick, practiced motion, she sliced the rope binding his wrists, leaving it looking intact but loose enough to shake off. "When we hit the canyon bend," she breathed into his ear. "Run for the rocks. Do not look back." Samuel nodded, his eyes wide and dark. She moved to the next child, and the next. She managed to cut the bonds of 6 of the older boys before the sergeant barked at her to climb aboard. The convoy lurched forward. 3 heavy wagons, flanked by 20 mounted soldiers, rumbled out of the fort gates. Eliza sat in the back of the first wagon, holding Nijoni Cade's sister on her lap. The little girl was shivering, though the morning was warming up. "He will come," Nijoni whispered in Navajo. "Hush," Eliza said, stroking her hair. "I know." They rolled across the valley floor, dust rising in choking clouds. Ahead lay the twisted maw of Canyon de Chelly, where the road narrowed between towering walls of red sandstone. It was the perfect choke point. Cade had promised to be there, but as the wagons approached the shadow of the cliffs, Eliza felt a prickle of wrongness. The soldiers were not riding in a relaxed travel formation. Their carbines were unholstered, resting on their thighs. Their eyes were scanning the ridge lines with intense focus. They knew. Up on the canyon rim, concealed behind a screen of juniper, Cade Nez checked the priming on his rifle. He had 10 warriors with him, men who had chosen to fight rather than fade away. They were outnumbered 2 to 1, but they had the high ground. "Wait for the lead wagon to pass the dead tree." Cade signaled to Hushki, the hot-headed warrior to his left. "Then we block the road." Below, the wagons entered the curve. Cade raised his hand to signal the attack, but before he could drop his hand, a bugle sounded from the rear of the convoy. Suddenly, the canvas covers of the second and third wagons were thrown back. They were not full of supplies, as Cade had thought. They were packed with riflemen. "Ambush!" Hushki screamed. The canyon erupted. The soldiers in the wagons opened fire on the ridge lines before the Navajo warriors could lose a single arrow. Bullets chipped the red rock, sending shards of stone flying like shrapnel. "Get down!" Eliza screamed, pulling Nijoni to the floor of the wagon. The horses screamed as the noise spooked them. The lead wagon jackknifed, slamming into the canyon wall. The children inside tumbled over each other, shrieking in terror. "Run!" Eliza shouted, shoving Samuel and the older boys toward the tailgate. "Run now!" The boys threw off their loose ropes and leaped from the wagon, scrambling toward the boulders. "They are escaping fire at will," Silas Crowley shouted. He was on horseback near the rear, safely out of the main fray, using his pistol to take pot shots at the fleeing children. Cade saw the trap spring. He saw his men pinned down by the overwhelming firepower. He realized with a sickening lurch that they had been betrayed. "Retreat!" he shouted to his men. "Get to the lower path. Save the children." He abandoned his cover and began to slide down the steep scree slope, risking his neck to get to the wagon where his sister and Eliza were trapped. Bullets kicked up dust around his boots. Down on the road, it was pure chaos. Dust, smoke, and the metallic tang of blood filled the air. Eliza scrambled out of the wrecked wagon, dragging Nijoni with her. "This way!" Eliza cried, pulling the girl toward a fissure in the rock wall. "Not so fast, teacher." Silas Crowley cut off their path, his horse rearing. He leveled his Colt revolver not at Eliza, but at the back of a fleeing Navajo boy, Thomas, who was 10 yards away. No, Eliza did not think. She did not calculate. She threw herself at Crowley's horse. Slamming her shoulder into the animal's flank, the horse stumbled. Crowley's shot went wide, shattering a rock harmlessly. Crowley roared in fury. He wheeled the horse around and aimed the gun directly at Eliza's chest. His face was twisted in a mask of pure hate. "You Indian-loving whore," he spat. "Die with them." Eliza stared down the barrel, time slowing to a crawl. She saw his finger whiten on the trigger. Crack. A rifle shot thundered from the slope above, distinct from the chaotic volley. Silas Crowley screamed as his hand exploded in a spray of red. The pistol went flying. He clutched his mangled wrist, nearly falling from his saddle. Eliza looked up. Cade was sliding down the last 10 feet of the cliff, his rifle smoking in his hand. He landed in a crouch, shielding her and Najoni instantly. "Go!" he roared at her. "To the hidden trail." "Cade," Eliza grabbed his arm. "There are too many of them. Go!" He pushed her toward the fissure, but as she turned, a soldier rose from behind the wagon wreck and fired blindly. Eliza felt a sensation like a red-hot poker being driven across her ribs. The impact spun her around. She gasped, the air leaving her lungs, and crumbled to her knees. "Eliza?" Cade abandoned the fight. He scooped her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing. She pressed her hand to her side. It came away wet and bright red. "I have you," Cade grunted, his breath coming hard. "Hold on." He ran. He ran with the desperation of a man carrying his entire world. He led Najoni and a group of 5 other children into the narrow fissure in the canyon wall, a secret path known only to the antelope and the Navajo. Behind them, the gunfire continued, but Cade did not look back. He climbed, carrying Eliza up the steep, twisting trail until the sounds of the battle faded into the distance, replaced by the rushing of wind and the pounding of his own heart. Eliza woke to the sound of water dripping. She was lying on a bed of furs and woven blankets. Above her, the ceiling was jagged stone, illuminated by the soft, flickering light of a small fire. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and burning sage. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in her side made her gasp. "Lie still." Cade was there instantly. He knelt beside her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. He had stripped off his shirt. His chest was streaked with dust and dried blood not his own. The scar on his neck seemed to pulse in the firelight. "The children?" Eliza whispered, her throat dry as parchment. "Safe," Cade said soothingly. "Najoni and the others are asleep in the back of the cave. My men took the rest deep into the stronghold. The soldiers did not follow us here. They fear the spirits of the canyon." He dipped a cloth into a wooden bowl of water and pressed it to her forehead. "You were shot, a graze. It broke a rib and took some skin, but the bullet passed through." Eliza looked down. Her torn blouse had been removed, and her torso was wrapped tightly in strips of clean linen. Beneath the bandage, she could feel a poultice of cool, pungent herbs. "You saved me," she said softly. "You saved Thomas." Cade corrected. "You threw yourself at a horse to save a child. You are a warrior. Eliza Monroe, foolish, but a warrior." For the next 3 days, time blurred. They were hidden in a cave near the source of the sacred spring, a place the army maps did not show. Cade tended to her with a terrifying tenderness. He changed her bandages, fed her broth, and kept the fire burning. And every morning, without fail, the ritual returned. Cade would leave the cave before dawn and return as the sun hit the canyon rim. He would produce a flat cake of cornbread he had baked on a flat stone, and a canteen of goat milk he had procured from a hidden herd nearby. Eliza, propped up against a saddle, watched him one morning as he sliced the bread with his hunting knife. "You know," she said, her voice weak but teasing, "if you keep bringing bread and milk, I might start thinking you are courting me. Cade Nez." Cade paused, the knife hovering over the bread. He looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable for a moment. Then, the corner of his mouth lifted in a rare, fleeting smile. "Eat," he said gruffly, handing her a piece. "You need your strength." But his eyes lingered on her mouth as she took a bite, and the air in the cave grew suddenly warm. On the 4th night, the fever from the wound had finally broken. The pain was a dull ache rather than a sharp fire. The children were asleep in the rear cavern, their breathing soft and rhythmic. The cave was quiet, save for the crackle of the juniper logs and the distant murmur of the spring. Eliza sat by the fire, her back resting against the stone wall. She had draped a heavy wool blanket over her shoulders to cover her bandaged state, though her shirt hung open to relieve the pressure on the wound. Cade entered from the darkness of the tunnel entrance. He had been on watch. He moved silently, coming to stand by the fire. He held nothing in his hands. No canteen, no corn husk bundle. Eliza looked up at him, the firelight dancing in her eyes. She felt a sudden, overwhelming pull toward him, a gravity that had been building for months, through silence and storms and gunfire. "No bread today?" she asked softly, tilting her head. "No milk? Am I no longer your morning duty? Warrior." Cade did not smile. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. He looked at the bandage on her side, then up to her eyes. He walked around the fire and knelt beside her. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He reached out and took the tin cup of water she had been holding, setting it aside on the dirt floor. His hands were large, rough-hewn by a life of survival, yet his touch as he brushed her knuckles was reverent. "Eliza," he said. His voice was rough, stripped of all pretense. He leaned closer, resting his forearm on his raised knee. His gaze locked onto hers, stripping her bare more effectively than his knife ever could. "Every day I brought bread and milk so I could stand close to your door without frightening you," he whispered. The silence stretched, heavy and electric. Eliza's heart began to hammer against her bruised ribs, a painful, wonderful rhythm. "Tonight," Cade continued, his voice dropping to a husky murmur that seemed to vibrate through her bones, "I bring you my heart, if you'll take it." Eliza stopped breathing. The world narrowed down to the firelight reflecting in his obsidian eyes. She saw the vulnerability there, the terrified hope of a man who had expected to die alone. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and placed her palm flat against his chest, directly over his heart. She could feel it beating strong, steady, alive. "I already took it. Cadenez," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "I took it the first day you saved my children." Cade let out a breath that sounded like a broken sob. He reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. She lifted her chin, closing the distance. When his lips touched hers, it was not tentative. It was an explosion of suppressed longing. It was the taste of smoke and salvation. He kissed her deeply, a desperate claim that seared through her. Eliza made a soft sound in her throat and wound her fingers into his long, dark hair, pulling him closer. He groaned, his arm going around her waist to support her, careful of her injury but holding her possessively tight. The kiss went on, a language of its own. It spoke of the fear of the last few days, the anger at the injustice, and the fierce, undeniable love that had bloomed in the desert dust. There was no need for words, no need for more than this, the press of bodies, the mingling of breath, the absolute certainty that they belonged to each other. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. Cade rested his forehead against hers. His eyes closed. "We cannot go back," he murmured. "No," Eliza agreed, running her thumb over the scar on his neck. "We cannot." "If you return to the fort, they will hang you, or put you in a cell until you rot. And if we stay here," Eliza said, "they will hunt us. They will bring more soldiers. The children will live like fugitives." Cade pulled back slightly to look at her. "Then what do we do?" Eliza looked at the fire. Her mind, sharpened by the danger, began to turn. She thought of the papers she had seen in the Reverend's office. She thought of the letters she had stolen from Silas Crowley's desk weeks ago, letters she had sewn into the lining of her skirt before the relocation began. "We do not hide," Eliza said, a cold determination hardening her voice. "We fight, but not with guns." She looked at Cade. "I have the letters." "Cade, the ones from the railroad company to Silas. They prove the bribery. They prove he started the fire. They prove he planned to murder the children to clear the land." "Words on paper," Cade said skeptically. "White man's paper." "Law," Eliza said. "There are men in the East, men in the church, who do not know what is happening here, or they choose not to know. We will make them look. You want to walk back into the lion's den?" "I want to tear the den down," Eliza said. We go back, but not as prisoners. We go back with the truth. We will go to the inquiry commission that is arriving in Santa Fe next week." Cade looked at her with a mixture of awe and fear. "It is a dangerous path. Is it more dangerous than this?" she asked, gesturing to the cave and her bandaged side. Cade took her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "No, it is not." He looked toward the sleeping children. "We will face them. Together. Together," Eliza repeated. She leaned back against the stone wall, Cade's arm around her shoulders, keeping her warm against the chill of the desert night. Outside, the wind howled through the canyon, but inside, for the first time in a long time, there was peace. They had lost the school. They had lost their safety. But in the flickering light of the fire, they had found something far more powerful. They had found a home in each other. And tomorrow, they will fight to keep it. The dust from the wagon train hung in the air for hours after Major Edward Sterling and his entourage arrived at Fort Defiance. They had come from Santa Fe, summoned by urgent telegrams that painted two very different pictures of the events of October 15th. One telegram, sent by Colonel Briggs, spoke of a violent uprising and the kidnapping of 30 children by a renegade war party. The other, sent anonymously by a sympathetic telegraph operator in Gallup, spoke of arson, attempted murder, and a teacher left for dead. Major Sterling was a man of the new army, a veteran of the Civil War who had seen enough blood to know that the loudest officer was usually the one with the most to hide. Beside him sat Bishop Lawrence, a representative of the church sent to investigate the spiritual failings of the mission. They sat at a long table in the center of the mess hall, which had been converted into a tribunal. Colonel Harlan Briggs stood at attention, his uniform pressed, though his face was pale. Reverend Abel Price sat with his hands folded, looking pious. Silas Crowley, his right hand heavily bandaged and supported by a sling, looked like a cornered rattlesnake. "The facts are simple. Major," Crowley said, his voice tight with pain and malice. "The woman, Eliza Monroe, was seduced by the savage Cade Nez. She conspired with him to open the gates. They set the fire to create chaos, then abducted the children to hold them for ransom against the railroad expansion." "Kidnapping," Major Sterling repeated, tapping a pen against the table. "And yet, the reports say the children went willingly." "Brainwashing," Reverend Price interjected smoothly. "The woman has been poisoning their minds with heathen superstition for months. She is as savage as they are." "And the fire?" the bishop asked. "The dormitory was destroyed. An Indian fire arrow." Briggs lied effortlessly. "We have found the remnants." Major Sterling looked at the three men. The story was clean. It was consistent. It was also, he suspected, a fabrication. But without witnesses, he had little choice but to accept the official report. "Very well," Sterling sighed. "We will issue a warrant for the arrest of Eliza Monroe and Cade Nez for treason and kidnapping. The cavalry will be dispatched to—" "There will be no need for the cavalry. Major—" The voice rang out from the open doorway of the mess hall, clear and unshakable. Every head turned. Eliza Monroe stood in the frame of the door. She looked nothing like the pristine schoolteacher who had arrived from Boston a year ago. Her calico dress was torn and stained with dry mud and dark, rusted blood. Her hair was loose, windblown, and tangled. A bandage was wrapped tightly around her ribs, visible through the rents in her bodice. She leaned heavily on a walking stick made of juniper wood, but her head was held high. Behind her stood Nijoni, holding her hand, and behind the child, flanked by two other Navajo children, was the shadowed figure of a man. "Miss Monroe," the bishop gasped, half rising from his chair. "I am here to answer the charges," Eliza said, limping forward. The silence in the room was absolute. She stopped 10 feet from the table, staring directly at Silas Crowley. "She is armed," Crowley shouted, fumbling for the pistol at his belt with his good hand. "Guards, arrest her! Sit down! Mr. Crowley!" Major Sterling barked. He looked at Eliza with a mixture of shock and respect. "You are injured, madam." "I was shot," Eliza said, her voice steady. by a soldier under the command of this man. She pointed a trembling finger at Crowley. While I was shielding a child from his bullet. Lies, Crowley spat. She was running with the renegades. I have brought the children back, Eliza said, ignoring him. Not because we trust you, but because we will not let you write this history with blood and ink that lies. She reached into the pocket of her skirt and pulled out a packet of letters, wrapped in oilcloth. She threw them onto the table. They landed with a heavy thud in front of the major. What is this? Sterling asked. Correspondence between Silas Crowley and the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad Company, Eliza said, outlining a payment of $5,000 to be deposited in a Denver bank account upon the successful removal of the Navajo tribe from the sacred spring, dated 2 months ago. Crowley's face drained of color. It also details the timeline, Eliza continued, her voice gaining strength, including the suggestion that a tragic accident at the school might expedite the relocation process. Major Sterling opened the first letter. He read it in silence. The room seemed to shrink. He looked up at Crowley, his eyes cold. Is this your signature, Mr. Crowley? It is a forgery, Crowley cried, sweat beading on his forehead. The woman is a witch. She forged it. I am a schoolteacher, Eliza said coldly. I teach penmanship. I know a man's hand when I see it. And the fire, the bishop asked, looking at the reverend. Did you know about this? I knew nothing, Price stammered, his pious mask crumbling. I only sought to save their souls. By beating them, Eliza asked. She gently pulled Najoni forward. Show them. Sweet one. The little girl trembled, but she turned her back to the tribunal and lowered the collar of her dress. The welts were weeks old, but they were still visible ugly. Raised ridges on her brown skin. The bishop covered his mouth. Good Lord, Reverend Price ordered this, Eliza said. 5 lashes. For speaking the word for mother in her own tongue. Colonel Briggs stood by and watched. It was discipline, Briggs shouted, slamming his hand on the table. Necessary discipline. We are taming animals here. Major, you cannot judge us from the comfort of Santa Fe. I judge you by the uniform you wear, Colonel, Sterling said quietly, and you are disgracing it. This is hearsay, Crowley screamed. You have the words of a hysterical woman and a mute child against 3 officers of the territory. She is not alone. The shadow in the doorway moved. Cade Nez stepped into the light. The reaction was instantaneous. The guards at the perimeter of the room raised their carbines. Hold fire, Major Sterling shouted. Standing up, Cade walked into the room. He was unarmed, save for the knife at his belt. He wore clean buckskin, and his hair was freshly braided. He moved with a fluid grace that made the soldiers look clumsy. He stopped beside Eliza, his shoulder brushing hers. He did not look at the soldiers. He looked only at the major. I am Cade Nez, he said. His English was accented but perfect, resonating off the wooden beams of the ceiling. I am the one you call enemy. You are a wanted man, Sterling said, his hand resting near his sidearm. You attacked this fort. I entered this fort to pull children from a burning building, Cade said. A fire lit by that man. He nodded toward Crowley. He shot me, Crowley shrieked, holding up his bandaged hand. He admits it. He tried to kill a government agent. I shot the gun from your hand, Cade corrected calmly. If I had wanted to kill you, Silas Crowley, I would not have missed your heart at 50 yards. I shot you because you were aiming at this woman. He gestured to Eliza. She stood between your bullet and a child. You turned your weapon on her. I stopped you. Cade looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the young soldiers standing guard. Is there no man here who saw this? Is there no man here who serves the truth? Silence stretched thin. Then, a young private near the door stepped forward. It was Miller, the boy who had found the footprints days ago. Private Miller, Colonel Briggs warned, his voice low and dangerous. Stand your post. Miller looked at the colonel, then at Eliza, who was leaning on her stick, pale and exhausted. He took a deep breath. I saw it, sir, Miller said to the major. I saw the agent aim at the teacher. and I saw the Indian, Mr. Nez, shoot the pistol out of his hand, and the fire. I saw Mr. Crowley's interpreter, Jonah, near the dormitory with a torch just before it went up. Jonah is gone, Crowley snapped. Convenient. We found him in Gallup yesterday, Major Sterling said dryly. Drunk and boasting about a $10 gold piece he received for a night's work. We have him in custody. Crowley slumped back in his chair, the fight draining out of him. Major Sterling stood up. He looked at the assemblage with the weary authority of a judge. Silas Crowley, you are under arrest for corruption, arson, and attempted murder. Guards, secure him. 2 soldiers moved forward, grabbing Crowley by his good arm. He did not struggle. He simply stared hatefully at Eliza as he was dragged out. Colonel Briggs, Sterling continued, you are relieved of command effective immediately. You will return to Santa Fe for a court-martial inquiry regarding your conduct and the abuse of wards of the state. Briggs stood stiffly, his face purple. He saluted sharply, turned on his heel, and marched out, stripping his gloves off as he went. And Reverend Price, the bishop said, his voice sorrowful but firm. You have failed in your shepherd's duty. You will pack your things. You are recalled to the diocese in Philadelphia. There will be no more teaching for you. Price looked down at his hands, muttering a prayer that sounded more like a curse. Eliza let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for a year. She swayed, her knees giving way. Cade caught her instantly, his arm going around her waist to support her weight. Careful, he murmured. Major Sterling watched them. He saw the way the Navajo warrior held the Boston schoolteacher. He saw the way the child, Najoni, pressed her face into Eliza's skirt. It was a tableau that defied every regulation in his book. Miss Monroe, Sterling said. Mr. Nez, you have exposed a great crime today, but that does not solve the problem of the school, or the children. The children stay, Cade said firmly. They do not go to the bosque. The order for relocation has been suspended pending the investigation, Sterling admitted. However, the law requires these children to be educated. We cannot simply leave them in the canyon. The government will insist on a school. Another prison? Eliza asked, her voice sharp. Another place where they cut their hair and beat their language out of them? A new school, the bishop suggested. Better managed, with a new reverend? No, Cade said. We will not give you our children again. Then the army will come back, Sterling said honestly. I cannot stop the tide of policy. Mr. Nez, I can only delay it, unless... He paused, looking at Eliza. He looked at the letters on the table, the evidence of her courage. He looked at the way she stood beside the warrior, a bridge between 2 warring worlds. Unless we try something different, Sterling said slowly. An experiment. The Department of the Interior is looking for a model of cooperative assimilation. I do not like that word, Cade said. Cooperation. Sterling corrected. Miss Monroe, you are a certified teacher. You have the trust of these people. What if we reopen the school, but not as a mission? What? Eliza asked. A day school, the bishop chimed in, sensing a way to salvage the church's reputation. The children live at home. They come to learn. They go home at night. And the language? Cade asked. English must be taught, Sterling said. That is the law. But Navajo will not be forbidden, Eliza said, looking at the major. No beatings, no name changes. And we teach them to read their own tongue as well. Sterling frowned. That is highly irregular. It is the only way, Cade said. If you want peace in this valley, Major, you must let us keep our souls while we learn your words. Sterling looked at the bishop. The bishop nodded slowly. If you agree to take responsibility, Miss Monroe, Sterling said, you will be the headmistress. You will answer for their progress. If they fail, if there is rebellion, it will be your name on the warrant. Eliza looked at Cade. She saw the question in his eyes. It was a heavy burden. It meant staying here, on the edge of the knife, forever fighting for funding, for respect, for safety. It meant she could never go back to Boston. But then she looked at Najoni. She looked at Samuel, who was peeking through the doorway. "I accept," Eliza said. "There are conditions," Cade added. His voice was hard. "The school moves. It must be built near the spring. The water belongs to the school, and the school belongs to the people. No fences, no guards." "The railroad wants that water," Sterling warned. "The railroad can build a pipe from the river 10 miles east." Cade said, "Crowley lied about the necessity. The spring stays with us." Major Sterling rubbed his temples. He was exceeding his authority, but he was also looking at a solution that did not involve a massacre. "Agreed," Sterling said. "On a probationary basis. 1 year." "1 year," Cade said. The major gathered his papers. "You have a difficult road ahead. Miss Monroe, you will be an outcast among your own kind." "I have found a new kind," Eliza said softly. The meeting adjourned. The soldiers dispersed, muttering. The air in the mess hall felt lighter, though the scent of stale tobacco remained. Eliza and Cade walked out into the sunlight of the courtyard. The glare was blinding. They stood in the center of the fort, the place where she had been thrown down, the place where he had been shot. Now, it was quiet. Eliza's legs finally refused to hold her. She stumbled, clutching her side. Cade caught her again, but this time, he did not just support her. He took her hand, her white, trembling hand in his dark, strong one. He interlaced their fingers. He did not care who was watching. He did not care about the soldiers on the wall or the major standing on the porch. "You are foolish," Cade whispered, lifting her hand to press it against his chest. "You stood before the wolf chief and bared your throat." "I learned from a warrior," Eliza smiled weakly. "We have a school to build," Cade said, looking toward the ridge where the spring waited. "And a home." "Yes," Eliza said. "But first, perhaps you could help me to the wagon. I think I am going to faint." Cade chuckled a low, warm sound that she felt in her own chest. He swept her up into his arms, carrying her bridal style across the parade ground. "I will carry you," he said. "Today and tomorrow." Eliza rested her head against his shoulder. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady beat of his heart. The war was not over. The world was still hard and full of sharp edges. But as they walked out of the gate, leaving the shadows of the fort behind them, Eliza knew they had won the only victory that mattered. They were free, and they were together. 2 years had passed since the smoke cleared from the courtyard of Fort Defiance, and the high desert of the New Mexico Territory had learned a new rhythm. It was no longer the staccato crack of rifle fire or the heavy thud of marching boots. It was the sound of a bell ringing clear across the sagebrush, followed by the shouting of children who were learning that the world was wide enough to hold 2 names for the same mountain. The Red Earth School sat on a rise of land 1/4 of a mile from the sacred spring. It was not a fortress of gray stone, but a structure of warm timber and adobe, painted with a wash of red clay that made it look as if it had grown straight out of the ground. The roof was shingled in cedar that smelled sharp and sweet in the rain, and the windows were large, inviting the sun rather than guarding against it. Above the door hung a sign, hand-carved from oak. On the top line, burnt into the wood, it read, "Red Earth School." Below it, in the flowing script of the land's first children, it read, "Tse Holoni Olta." Eliza Monroe stood on the porch, shading her eyes against the morning glare. She looked different than the pale, frightened girl who had arrived in a stagecoach 3 years ago. Her skin was browned by the wind and sun, etched with the fine lines of a woman who spent her days smiling at children and squinting at the horizon. She wore a simple dress of blue calico, but around her waist was a wide leather belt studded with silver conchos, and on her wrist sat a heavy turquoise cuff gifts from a grandmother she had never met, but who now called her daughter. "Make sure you wash the slate. Thomas," she called out, her voice carrying easily over the yard. Thomas, who also answered proudly to his given name. Ashki grinned and dunked his slate into the water barrel. Beside him stood a boy with freckles and hair the color of straw, the son of the new blacksmith in town. They were arguing good-naturedly about whose turn it was to erase the chalkboard. Eliza smiled. It was a small thing, 2 boys washing a slate. But in this territory, where blood had been spilled over less than a glance, it was a miracle. She turned as a shadow fell across the porch. Cade Nez walked up the steps. He moved with the same silent grace that had once terrified her, but the tension in his shoulders was gone. He was no longer a man hunted. He was a man who had planted his feet. He wore his hair in traditional braids wrapped in white wool, but he also wore a collared shirt tucked into his buckskin trousers. He was frowning, though his eyes were bright. "That child," Cade grumbled, leaning his bow against the railing. "Najoni runs like a jackrabbit. She has been barefoot since dawn. I told her the scorpions are waking up, but she just laughs and says her feet are tougher than their stingers." "She gets that stubbornness from her brother," Eliza teased, reaching out to straighten his collar. Cade caught her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "And she gets her tongue from her teacher." "Is the water flowing well?" Eliza asked, her tone shifting to the business of survival. "Strong," Cade said. "The winter snows were heavy in the mountains. The spring is deep, the horses are fat, and the garden is green. We will have corn this year. Eliza, real corn." He looked out at the schoolyard, where 20 children, Navajo and white, sitting side by side on log benches, were waiting for the bell. "They look happy," he said softly. "It is strange. I still expect to see soldiers when I look down from the ridge." "The soldiers are still there," Eliza said, glancing toward the distant walls of the fort. "But they are learning, too. Major Sterling sends a water wagon every Tuesday, just as he promised, and he tips his hat when he sees me. He tips his hat because he is afraid you will write another letter to the bishop." Cade chuckled. "The pen is mightier than the sword." "Cade Nez," Eliza said, tapping his chest. "Perhaps," Cade said, pulling her slightly closer. "But the heart is mightier than both." The integration was not a fairy tale. Eliza knew this every time she went into Gallup for supplies. There were still shops where the silence grew heavy when she walked in. There were still women who pulled their skirts aside as she passed, whispering Indian lover or traitor behind their hands. To them, she was a fallen woman, a creature who had stepped outside the bounds of her race and station. One afternoon, 6 months prior, a traveling salesman from the east had stood on the porch of May O'Rourke's saloon and spat on the ground near Eliza's hem. "Disgraceful," the man sneered. "A white woman playing house with a savage. You ought to be ashamed to show your face in a Christian town." Before Eliza could respond, the door of the saloon swung open. May O'Rourke, wiping her hands on a dirty apron, stepped out with a shotgun broken open over her arm. "You will mind your tongue, mister," May barked. "That woman saved more souls in one night than you will in a lifetime, and her husband is a better man than any starch-collared fool I have ever served whiskey to." The salesman had sputtered, looking for support from the locals, but the blacksmith just crossed his arms, and the sheriff, who was drinking a coffee nearby, looked the other way. Eliza had walked past the salesman with her head high. She did not need their approval. She had her dignity, and she had Cade. The wedding had happened 2 months ago, when the desert was blooming with globe mallow and Indian paintbrush. It had been a day of 2 worlds. In the morning, under the vast, open sky, the Navajo elders had gathered around a fire built of sweet cedar. Eliza sat on a blanket of woven wool beside Cade. They did not exchange gold rings. Instead, Cade's grandmother washed Eliza's hands in water from the sacred spring, and then washed Cade's. They ate cornmeal from a wedding basket, sealing a bond that went deeper than law. "Now you are of the clans," the grandmother had whispered, touching Eliza's face. "You are the weaver of words." In the afternoon, Major Sterling, true to his word and perhaps trying to ensure the peace was documented, officiated a civil ceremony in the schoolhouse. He read from the Book of Common Law, his voice stiff but respectful. "Do you, Eliza Monroe, take this man?" "I do," Eliza said, her voice ringing off the rafters. "And do you, Cade Nez, Take this woman." Cade looked at Eliza, not at the major. "I'll take her," he said, "for as long as the sun rises." When it was done, there was a feast that defied all boundaries. Roast mutton sat beside apple pie. Soldiers danced with Navajo grandmothers. May O'Rourke cried into her handkerchief, blowing her nose with a sound like a trumpet on the marriage certificate. Eliza signed her name Eliza Nez. But on the school charter, hanging on the wall behind the desk, she remained Eliza Monroe. 2 names, 2 lives, 1 woman holding them together. The mourning ritual had returned, but the secrecy was gone. The sun was just cresting the red cliffs, painting the valley in shades of violet and gold. Eliza was in the small kitchen attached to the schoolhouse, stoking the wood stove. The back door opened. Cade walked in. The cool morning air followed him, smelling of sage. In one hand, he held a clay jug of fresh goat milk. In the other, wrapped in a clean linen cloth, was a stack of hot cornbread. He set them on the table. Eliza turned from the stove. Wiping her floury hands on her apron, she looked at the offering, then up at him. "You are late," she teased gently. "The bell rings in 1 hour." The goat was stubborn, Cade said, his eyes dancing with amusement. "She did not want to be milked by a married man. She says I have lost my wild edge." "And have you?" Eliza asked, stepping closer to him. Cade reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I am still wild, Eliza, but I am no longer wandering." He tapped the jug of milk. "Now the whole valley knows I bring you bread and milk. There is no hiding in the shadows. No secret notes." "I like the secret notes." Eliza smiled. "They were very dramatic. They were necessary," Cade said. He rested his hands on her waist, pulling her against him. The warmth of his body was a comfort she would never take for granted. "But this is better. And what do you bring me today, warrior?" she asked, echoing the question she had asked him in the cave. "The night everything changed. Besides breakfast." Cade looked down at her, his expression softening into that profound, quiet love that still took her breath away. "I'll bring you home," he whispered, kissing her forehead. "If you will keep it." Eliza rested her head against his chest. "I will keep it," she said, "until the mountain falls." Later that day, the classroom was buzzing with the energy of 20 minds at work. Eliza stood at the front, pointing to a map of the territory she had drawn on the chalkboard. "This is the river," she said in English. Then, switching effortlessly to Navajo, she added, "Two. Two," the children repeated in a chorus. A hand went up in the back row. It was William, the blacksmith's son. He looked confused. "Teacher," William asked, his brow furrowed, "my PA says this is American land now, but Samuel says it is Dine land. Who is right? Are we Navajo or American?" The room went quiet. It was the question that hung over everything. The question that the politicians in Washington and the warriors in the hills were killing each other to answer. Eliza looked at the faces looking up at her. Dark eyes, blue eyes, brown skin, freckled skin. They were sitting on the same bench, sharing the same slate. She crouched down so she was eye level with them. "Look at the dust on your boots." "William," she said, "what color is it?" "Red," William said. "And Samuel?" She looked at the boy who had once been beaten for speaking his name. "Look at the dust on your moccasins. What color is it?" "Red," Samuel said. "The earth does not know the lines drawn on a map." Eliza said softly, "You are both. You are children of this land. That is what matters. You breathe the same air. You drink the same water. You are neighbors." Cade, who had been standing in the doorway sharpening a tool, stepped into the room. The children turned to him. To them. He was a hero, the man who could hit a coin thrown in the air with an arrow. "The land does not choose one name," Cade said, his deep voice filling the room. "It holds all of us. It does not care if you call the water river or two. It only cares that you protect it." He looked at William. "Do you protect the spring, William?" "Yes, sir," the boy said seriously. "Then you are off the land." Cade said. Eliza smiled at her husband. They were building something here. It was slow, and it was fragile. But it was real. The twist came a week later, in the form of a carriage rolling up the dusty road from Santa Fe. Eliza watched it approach with a knot of dread in her stomach. Carriages usually meant trouble inspectors, tax collectors, or soldiers. But the man who stepped out was neither. He was an older gentleman with kind eyes and a physician's bag, accompanied by a clerk from the Department of the Interior. "Mrs. Nez," the man asked, tipping his hat. "I am Dr. Harrison. I believe you knew my predecessor. Dr. Albright?" "I did," Eliza said guardedly. Cade stepped up beside her, his hand resting on the knife at his belt, a reflex he had never quite lost. "We come with news," the clerk said, nervous under Cade's stare. "The report on your school has reached Washington. The success rates, the health of the children, the lack of conflict. It is unprecedented." "We are just teaching," Eliza said. "You are doing more than that," Dr. Harrison said. "You are proving a point. The government is considering using your model, the Red Earth model. They are calling it as a pilot program for the entire territory. They want to stop the forced relocations to the boarding schools. They want to try cooperative day schools instead." Eliza felt the world tilt slightly. "They want to copy us. If it works here," the doctor said, "it could save thousands of children from being taken from their homes. It could change the policy of the entire West." Eliza looked at Cade. She had expected a fight. She had expected them to come to shut her down. She had not expected to become the architect of a new future, but fear spiked in her heart. If the government gets involved, they will want to control it. They will send regulations. They will send paperwork. They will dilute what we have built. "They might," Cade said, looking at the doctor. "But if they do not copy us, they will destroy us. Is it not better to lead the horse than to be trampled by it?" Eliza looked at the children playing in the yard. She thought of Najoni, who was safe in her own bed every night instead of a cold dormitory. "We will show them," Cade said to her, his voice low. "Not with speeches, not with reports, but with our children. Let them come. Let them see that a warrior can hold a book as easily as a rifle." Eliza nodded slowly. "Then let them come." The sun began to set, turning the sky into a canvas of burning orange and deep violet. It was the time of day when the desert felt most alive, suspended between the heat of the day and the chill of the night. They gathered at the sacred spring. It was not a formal ceremony, just the end of a long day. Eliza, Cade, Najoni, and a dozen other children stood by the water's edge. A group of soldiers from the fort had come down with the water wagon. They were new recruits, young boys from Ohio and New York, who looked at Cade not with hatred, but with a sort of awed curiosity. A herd of wild mustangs, the ones Cade used to run with, came down from the ridge to drink on the far bank. They dipped their heads, blowing soft breaths into the water. Eliza knelt by the edge of the pool. The water was crystal clear, reflecting the first evening star. She placed her hand in the water. It was cold, shocking, and pure. Cade knelt beside her. He placed his large, dark hand over hers. Najoni laughed and slapped her hand on top of theirs. Samuel added his. William added his. One of the young soldiers, hesitant at first, took off his glove and dipped his fingers into the water a few feet away. Eliza looked up. In her mind's eye, the camera pulled back. It rose up, higher and higher. It saw the circle of hands touching the water-red hands, white hands, small hands, scarred hands. It saw the green oasis of the spring, a jewel in the dry earth. It saw the red roof of the schoolhouse, glowing in the twilight. It saw the adobe walls of the fort, no longer a prison, but a neighbor. And far in the distance, on the edge of the horizon, it saw the thin plume of smoke from the iron horse, the railroad that was coming. The future was coming, inevitable and loud. But here, by the water, they were ready. Eliza thought back to the girl who had stood in the kitchen door 3 years ago, terrified of the vastness of this land, clutching a bucket of milk. She thought of the warrior who had watched her from the ridge. a silhouette of resistance. She looked at Cade now. He was looking at her, and in his eyes, she saw the reflection of the entire world they had built. She had a home, she had a husband, she had a child, she had a school. She had a war that she had chosen, and she would continue to fight it not with bullets, but with bread, with milk, and with a love that was stubborn enough to bloom in the desert. Sometimes, the loudest revolution is not a gunshot, but a loaf of bread broken between enemies. Sometimes, the bravest thing a warrior can do is not to take a life, but to offer his heart to the one person who could break it. And sometimes, the Wild West is not just a place of blood and gold. It is a place where two worlds, against all odds, learn to kneel down and drink from the same sacred stream. Thank you for journeying with me through the dust and the starlight of this tale. It has been an honor to spin this yarn for you. I would love to hear from you. Where in the world are you listening to this story from? Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on Eliza and Cade's journey. If this tale touched your heart, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Like the video, and hit that hype button so that the wind can carry this story to even more listeners. Until we meet again on the trail.